Good evening, everyone. We're just waiting for one or two more people to join us, and we'll start any second now. Okay, so once again, good evening and a very warm welcome. I'm Sarah McDougall, Director of Benery and Curator of the current exhibition, Sheer Verve, the Women's International Art Club, 1898 to 1978. And this evening's event is part of our accompanying programme of ongoing and related talks. Before we begin, just the usual housekeeping note to remind you that the event is being recorded, so please keep your cameras and volume off throughout the speaker's presentation to lessen any possible interference. The chat function will be open throughout, so please do type your questions into the thread for our lively Q&A at the end. I'm really delighted to be joined this evening by our guest speaker, Dr. Marianne Mancio, who I'm sure many of you will know already. For those who don't, Marianne trained as an artist prior to her DPhil, Maps for Wayward Performers, Feminist Readings of Contemporary Live Art Practice in Britain, and she also has an MPhil in creative writing. She writes and lectures on art internationally, including for her own company, Hotel Alphabet. And also, she's a founder member and co-director of InFem's Art Collective and has recently co-curated the exhibition Lost Girls for War Child at Flowers Gallery in London. The title of Marianne's talk tonight is Colour Electric, Women Pioneers of Abstract Art. And now over to you, Marianne.
Thank you very much for having me. And so for a talk on women's art, it seems a shame to start with a slide by a male artist, but there is a relevance, and the relevance is that essentially for a very long time, the narrative of art history told us that Kandinsky was probably the first artist to create an abstract painting, and this may even have been one of them, this abstract watercolor. We know that Kandinsky himself, a synesthetic, so somebody who heard color, heard noise as color, heard music as color, was very inspired to make a series of works, improvisations, compositions, so works with abstract titles, and working very spontaneously, often leaving parts of the canvas to come through or parts of the paper. And this was the narrative for a very long time. And it was a narrative that I guess it ignored some other paintings that were happening at a similar time. For example, this little Vanessa Bell painting, which may be familiar to some of you from the Tate collection. Vanessa Bell, one of the famous Bloomsbury group, this little oil and gouache painting, very medium size, with just these blocks of color on this yellow ground. We don't even know which way round the work is, if we're honest. There are no inscriptions that tell us. We can guess a little bit by the direction of the brushwork. There's a little bit of a pencil underdrawing that you can see, and we know it was made around 1914. And she only made 4 completely abstract works in all of her oeuvre. So what was she doing? Was she experimenting with abstraction when she made this? Was this a little exercise? Or was she really seriously engaging with abstraction? Was she thinking about, for example, the theories of her art critic Clive Bell or the painter and critic Roger Fry, and looking at those things, this idea of form and signification? Then there is also, some of you may have seen more recently in various exhibitions around the vortices, the work of Helen Saunders, again around the same time, around 1915, one of the key founding member of the vortices, this group that grows up in England in the middle of the First World War, described by Wyndham Lewis as a whirlpool. At the heart of the whirlpool, he said, is a great silent place where all the energy is concentrated. And there, at the point of concentration, is the vorticist. She was important enough that she signed the Vorticist Manifesto in the first issue of the magazine Blast. There were a lot of her artworks and writings that turned up in Blast in various forms, but she tends to be forgotten because we remember Wyndham Lewis and we remember the male members of that movement. And also, unfortunately, none of her oil paintings survive. There's one theory, one story, maybe apocryphal, that her sister used to use her oil paintings to cover the floor of her pantry. And unfortunately, obviously, they deteriorated. But you can see, even if there are figurative roots to these paintings, even if there are suggestions of arms and legs and bodies in movement, it is at heart an abstract painting. And then more recently still, everything got tipped on its head by the rediscovery, let's say, of the Swedish artist Hilma af Klint. And this is an installation shot for a Guggenheim exhibition called Paintings for the Future. And she was an artist who, at the age of 20, went to the Academy in Stockholm, graduated with honors in 1887, came out at that point making figurative work, founded a group known as the Five, which was her and 4 other female artists. And then suddenly in 1906, after 20 years of making art, at the age of 44, she paints her first series of abstract paintings. And some critics have tried to downplay this on the grounds that she never showed them, she didn't exhibit them widely, they were mostly kept for personal exhibition. The major paintings that she made, which she calls works for the temple, which she continued between 1908 and 1915, were inspired by the spiritual world. And the big paintings are really, really big, 240 by 320 centimeters. And these made by a little woman, she was only 5 foot. And going through the various phases of life from childhood to old age. But you can see very clearly some geometric forms, helixes, these very modern colors. They're incredibly fresh for 1907 onwards, which makes us rewrite, as I say, the narrative. Is it possible Kandinsky knew of her works, possibly through their mutual, let's say, admiration of Rudolf Steiner? So if we are to rewrite a little bit the history of abstract art and start to reconsider some of the female players, unfortunately, we find that there is a real mix of artists who, now have had their due, mostly through the work of scholarship, feminist scholarship, and recent exhibitions, but then other artists who were successful in their time, but have since been forgotten. So there's a bit of a mix of both of them tonight. One that is perhaps better known, but very important, was Sonia Delaunay, who was born in Ukraine as Sarah Stern, who went to live with her uncle and aunt in St. Petersburg at a very young age, and they were very cultivated, they were quite wealthy, they were Jewish. She adopted their surname, and she wanted to go off to study painting in Germany and then to Paris at the age of 21. But her family was pressurizing her, a woman on her own in Paris in that period. She needed a husband. And so she has a marriage of convenience to a gay art critic and collector called Willem Under, who's going to stay friends with her for life, but it is a pure marriage of convenience. And it gives her an excuse to go to Paris. And so by the time she meets the man that she would consider her soulmate, the artist Robert Delaunay, and by the time she marries him in 1910 at the age of 25, she's already changed countries, changed her name, been married. She's had quite a life already. And she liked to say that they really work together, that one would inspire the other. And she too begins as a figurative artist. And when we look at her early works, like this Nude in Yellow, I think you can see the influence here of the Fauves, those artists that had caused such a scandal between 1905 and 1908. People like Matisse, de Vlaminck, Derain. Also a little bit of post-impressionism here. You could think of an artist like Gauguin, who was reinventing the form of the odalisque or the nude. And yet we also see this fascination with color that we can see in this painting is going to continue into her abstract work. And eventually this figurative element, although it does crop up again in her works from time to time, more or less disappears, and she's going to start making these really exciting abstract paintings, helped at this point by the death, it has to be said, of her aunt in St. Petersburg, who's left her some property. So for this period, she and Robert Delaunay have a bit of income. They're having these wonderful salons where they're inviting friends, fellow artists, so fellow colorists actually, like Kandinsky, like Chagall, poets as well, Guillaume Apollinaire, who's going to become very important, and also Blaise Centre. So this is her circle. But it's really this little blanket that she stitches for her son Charles in 1911 that is the breakthrough piece. And we're going to see, I think, one of the interesting things is many of the art forms through which these women explore abstraction or arrive at abstraction are not actually painting. It's textiles, it's ceramics, and then leads them into painting. And you can see it is a real patchwork of different colors. We've got greens, they've faded a little bit here, but pinks, a little bit of black, and so on. And she said, I had the idea of making for my son, who'd just been born, a blanket composed of bits of fabric like those I'd seen in the houses of Russian peasants. And when I was finished, the arrangement of the pieces of material seemed to me to evoke Cubist conceptions. And then we tried to apply the same process to other objects and paintings. And I find that a very interesting phrasing, because that implies that this comes first. And then she and Robert Delaunay started to apply this abstract construct to painting. And so this notion of now we would hang this quite happily, this textile, as a piece of art in itself, even though it was made for a functional purpose. But we can see how it links to some of the other ideas that were in the air at the time. So many of these writers, for example, people like Apollinaire that I mentioned, he was very interested in the notion of music and movement and color. And there was a place called the Bal Bullier, which is a dance hall, which was on the Boulevard Saint-Michel in Paris. And it was one such place that all the avant-garde would go. And we know that she used to go there and Robert used to go there. And so probably this enormous 12-foot long canvas is based on her experience of going dancing. There were also there's another link with another important Russian writer, Andrei Bele, who is a poet and a novelist. And he'd written these long prose poems between 1899 and 1908, and he called them symphonies. So we could see this parallel between what Kandinsky's doing, what Delaunay's doing, what Bele's doing. And in them, they were really like dreams. So it wasn't a clear narrative. It was lots of fragments. So again, inspired by Cubism, this idea of simultaneity, that all these things are happening simultaneously, this breaking down of the notion that even a perspective that Cubism did, this idea that instead of seeing the world from one fixed place with your eye closed, you're now standing there and seeing, hearing, smelling, things are moving around you. So lots of things happening simultaneously. Time is shifting. And what she's tried to show here is, in a sense, although it's abstract, this group of dancers under these lights. And most particularly, it becomes an essay in a way in color combination, in color theory, because from the mid-19th century onwards, there was the chemist called Chevreul, who had been exploring this notion of what happens when you combine a primary color with a secondary color, and how, you see it here as well, primary and complementaries, lots of reds and greens, blues and oranges, yellows and purples, and how those colors make their opposite color sing. So this is very important. But also we have to link it again to her textile practice, because when she was going to this Bal Bullier, this very avant-garde place, she was likely wearing one of her own creations, like this simultaneous dress. And they say that Robert Delaunay also wore this very multicolored suit, which she designed and a tailor made. There are parallels here with what was going on with the Futurist movement, the Italian Futurist movement. You have people like Giacomo Balla, who are working with colored suits with the leg in one color and the other leg in another color, the heel of one shoe higher than another. So clothing is being seen as a very clear marker of the avant-garde. But again, she's really exploring color here. And think this is a static image, obviously, but if you could try to imagine dancing in this dress and what would happen to those colors and those patterns, this is also important. And so it's not such a leap to get from here back to this. You can almost imagine this as either the same dance or a row of dancers in these simultaneous fashions, these simultaneous clothes. And she also will explore this interest in writing, in text, and in music and in movement in this work that she did, which is essentially an illustration of a poem by Blaise Centre called the Trans-Siberian and Le Petit Jean. So Jean is a sex worker who goes with the poet in 1905 on this semi-imaginary journey across the Trans-Siberian Railway. And it's the kind of narrative that has lots of flashbacks, flash forwards. So it's very difficult to keep hold again of a linear narrative. And they go from Moscow to Siberia, China, the North Pole, and they end up in Paris. And in Paris, Paris is implied through this motif of the Eiffel Tower. And the whole thing would fold up like an accordion. So you could stretch it out. So it's a very different way of reading. And you can see how there are these patches of color, and they're not even patches. There are lots of different kind of shapes. There's also different typefaces to try and evoke the mood of the poem. And the joy of this is that they plan to make a print run of 150 copies, that if you stacked them end to end, it would reach 300 feet high, the length or the height, if you like, of the Eiffel Tower. So really lots of things going on here, lots of kind of clever things. But most importantly, it's bringing together these ideas, this notion of transit and travel and speed, which the futurists had explored a little bit, with this idea of simultaneity, with this idea of modernity, and almost this notion of looking out the window and seeing a blur. You could see this as the sort of end point of where Turner started this investigation with his very famous Rain, Steam, and Speed. And she would continue through the 1920s to make various things, various dresses, working with costume designers, the famous Diaghilev, of course. She was making dress poems. She was setting up her own boutique, La Maison Delaunay. She was collaborating with even stores like Liberty. I love this photograph, I have to say, of her with the car. I think that's a classic photograph of her wearing her clothes where you're even matching your car. And they would be still continuing. Here's one of her dress poems on the right. These salons with these intellectuals. So you can imagine a whole literary salon of people coming dressed in her clothes. She starts incorporating poetry by surrealists or Dadaists in her design. And the Dadaists like Tristan Tzara, for example, would contribute text to her work. And the other inspiration was electric light itself, because apparently once time that she and Robert Delaunay were walking down the Boulevard Saint-Michel and they saw the new electric lamplights, and they thought, how can we recreate the glow of that in our paintings? So yes, on the one hand, you have these circular forms like prisms, like overlapping prisms, but I think it doesn't really become so much about a painting of a lamp or a painting of a light as an abstract painting celebrating these wonderful bright colors. I mean, you can see also where the pop art of the 1960s will get some of its inspiration from these early works. And she will become ultimately the first living artist to have a retrospective exhibition at the Louvre. So that's not until 1964. But as I say, you can see why in the 60s her work would have been particularly popular. And she really doesn't deviate from this investigation in color and form throughout that time. So a very important figure, but as I say, perhaps now finally quite celebrated. Less so would be an artist like Margarita Greta Heyman-Lobenstein-Marx. So you might find her named in different ways. Sometimes she's just called Margarita Heyman. So this could also be a reason why perhaps she's not as well known as she should be. She's somebody who was born also to a very artistic Jewish family, who trained in Cologne, where she was born, and then in Dusseldorf. So she went to a school of art and painting. And then in 1920, she isn't always abstract. So this is one of her little figurative works, for instance, which has no date, unfortunately. But then in 1920, she gets accepted at the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus is one of those legendary schools of art where we think that the narrative is that women were accepted and therefore it was very different from other art schools and women were welcomed. In actual fact, it was a bit more problematic than that, because many women were pushed into various workshops. So they were pushed away from the painting towards the weaving workshops. And some of those women would comply with that and did agree to do that. But she was very sure of what she wanted to do, and she refused. And she said she wanted to study ceramics. And interestingly, there was only one other female ceramic student in the class. And this is her, Marguerite Friedlander-Wildenhain, who we're going to talk about a little bit later. So she had to appeal to Gropius, Walter Gropius, the director at the Bauhaus, to ask him if she could join this class, and eventually he backs down. And the position of the women at the Bauhaus is, of course, they were exposed also to everything else via the theatre workshop that was happening, the painting workshops, the sculpture workshops, the colour theory. So we can see that colour theory, we can see the different iterations of art that was going on at the Bauhaus, this notion that form should follow function, so very well illustrated, for instance, by this chessboard, where the pieces are actually made in the shapes in which they're allowed to move, to remind the player how they can move that particular piece. But because she found herself clashing with her teacher, Gerhard Marx, she left Bauhaus after a year. But before she leaves, I think we still see the impact of some of the Bauhaus ideas. So the fact that the Bauhaus were using quite simple forms. So even as late as 1930, when she makes this teapot, we can see elements of Bauhaus. And also the way that Bauhaus liked to incorporate geometric forms, the circle, the triangle, the square. And she was producing this in several colors, by the way. So this one's this kind of lemony yellow and blue, but she also made one in brown and also one in turquoise. Funnily enough, her pieces were more popular outside of Germany. So the particular countries that loved her work, the English loved them, the French loved them, and the Americans would import them. Because when she got married in 1923 to a young industrialist called Gustav Lobenstein, they set up a pottery just so that she could produce her own designs. And they were very much like this. Sometimes they had patterns on them, very similar to kind of constructivism that was happening or inspired by the art of Russia. And it was a big factory. She had 120 people. She was exporting designs to the US, to Britain, as I said. A tragic thing when her husband was killed in a car crash in 1928. So suddenly she's there, widowed with 2 sons, having to run the factory by herself. And then, of course, this is another one of her works. You can see, the simplicity, very elegant works that she was making. But of course, we are also seeing post World War I Germany, that kind of Weimar Republic period, the real problems, the economic problems in Germany, the depression, the economy, and Jewish businesses being very much targeted. And then in 1934, the Nazi Party literally take over her factory. She's forced to sell it for nothing, basically. And one of her clients who owned Heels, Ambrose Heel, helps her and her sons leave Germany and come to Britain. And so that was very difficult for her, because suddenly she's finding herself in the potteries in Stoke-on-Trent, never quite regaining her glory, either as an entrepreneur or her kind of design, let's say her, not her identity, but her reputation. And again, being a woman, pretty much alone, falling out with her male colleagues, she finds her own pottery. She sells her designs to old clients, including Heels. But then by 1939, of course, World War II has started. She remarries, she moves to London, she paints, and she's seen as not a particularly good painter at the time. But ultimately, the important thing is that she was making these works, which was so different to what was happening in the potteries at the time. When you think that a lot of these local manufacturers were making these really dainty little tea sets with flowers, and here she is making something with really modern designs. I mean, you see this, and again, it looks like it's 20 years before its time. But one of the reasons also that she had been forced out of Germany was the degenerate art concept, because by June of 1933, the Reich's Cultural Chamber had been established, and there was a subgroup of this chamber that was in charge of porcelain, glass, household and kitchenware production in Germany. And we don't talk about this so much. I think lately there's more research into this area, because of course most of us know about the paintings that were taken and displayed in the Degenerate Art Exhibition, the artists that were targeted for being Jewish or you know, whatever other thing that was against them, or just being too avant-garde. But actually, pottery was also classed as degenerate, anything that was seen to be too modern. And works were seized. I mean, we know that artist works were seized, like this poor woman, Elfriede Lohse-Wackler, who suffered a nervous breakdown, and as a result of that was diagnosed with schizophrenia and forcibly sterilized, and was one of the people that was gassed by the Nazis. So, you know, there were really, really severe consequences, obviously, just even for putting your head above the parapet and continuing to insist on a modernist aesthetic if you were also Jewish. And yet, by staying in Britain, she did suffer, because some of her other contemporaries who fled Germany ended up going to America. And going to America meant that you could ally yourself with the attempt to create a new Bauhaus in America under Mies van der Rohe. So it was short-lived, but nonetheless, that was where the avant-gardist was seen to have gone. And she suffered very much in comparison to her kind of colleague at Bauhaus, Marguerite Wildenhain Friedlander, who had also trained at the Bauhaus under Gerhard Marx, but had stayed there, had remained there, and had emigrated to Holland and then moved to California in 1940. And what she managed to do is to make that shift from being seen as an industrialist potter, which is what Greta Marx was seen as, to being seen as a fine artist potter. And I know this is still a very contentious difference. And so when she was talking about making a set like this, and this is a late work from 1971, she wanted to move away from mass-produced pottery. She wanted to create something that was expressive, that had emotion, that was still abstract, but where the clay, the raw clay itself, that she sometimes left unglazed, was earthy and represented her interest in nature. So it's a move away from that kind of obviously modernist style, but paradoxically, she's remembered as more of a modernist artist. Another lesser known artist is Anna Meers, and I think Ben-Uri will know, much more than me, to be honest, about Anna Meers's pedigree, because she too was born into a Jewish family in this time in Vienna, in Austria-Hungary, in 1906, raised in Vienna, goes to study fine art in Switzerland and also at the Academy in Vienna. But she flees to London in 1938 when the Nazis annex Austria, and she goes to the Slade. So we should have records of her work because she showed a lot in London. And there are so many painters, I think, that this happens to, where for this period they're shown, she was showing at Cork Street, she was showing at a gallery called the AIA, the Artists International Association. She was showing at Ben-Uri in the 1940s and 50s. She, in the 70s, was having important solo shows at Judah Fine Art in London. She was working both figuratively and abstractly, mainly on quite a large scale, actually, so kind of making works. But two things were always very important to her, and one was color and the other was content. So even if the work was abstract, there was a content there. Because she lived for a while in Taormina in Sicily, very nice, beautiful, sunny climate, you do see a sense of color that is very Mediterranean, let's say. So a work like this, for example, very vibrant. She often has, even in her works like this, it's so much like figurative abstract, because half of your canvas is literally abstract, and then you have this tiny figurative element, which feels almost poetic. It feels almost narrative, just a few symbols. Some people have compared her to Chagall, for example. It's probably the horses and so on. She also got to be known enough in her time that Truman Capote asked her to illustrate the cover of his novel, The Grass Harp, in 1951. But until relatively recently, her works were really going for very, very little money. I'm talking like under £1,000 for these works, which, as we've seen, are quite large scale. And as we've seen, were being exhibited alongside some very important figures in London. And then she just disappears, kind of goes out of fashion. So very often with artists like this, because there's not a huge amount of information available, they just disappear, and we need to bring them back, as it were. But she was another important figure at the time. And then, of course, we have the two enormous, or more than two, but at least two important female artists, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham and Sandra Blow, who were down at St Ives. So from the 1950s onwards, there was this wonderful, incredible group of artists who had based themselves at St Ives, who, in this case, they were friends from the 1950s onwards, who were doing lots of very interesting work in different mediums, so painting, printmaking, draftsmanship, in a Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, or Willie as she liked to be known, case. She had come as well from a kind of very old-fashioned formal family, quite religious family, but she was determined to be an artist. Her father didn't want her to be, but her aunt persuaded him that she could go to the Edinburgh College of Art. And eventually she graduates, gets various scholarships. She's exhibiting in the summer exhibitions, so and so forth. But because of the dangers of the war, she decides not to stay in London. She's also not particularly well. And so she moves to St Ives in March of 1940. And right through until her death, she would have a studio in St Ives. She gets to meet all of the key players, so the likes of Ben Nicholson, Barbara Hepworth, Alfred Wallace, Terry Frost, Peter Lanyon, Roger Hilton, all of the school, essentially. And it is also a collector of their work. So she establishes her own collection of her own works when she's in her 70s, because she was very aware, I think, that perhaps she hadn't got the due of some of her peers. And so, as well as collecting work by other artists, she made sure that there was a legacy where her own works were properly, I guess, archived in a sense. And some of these works came into her collection in very interesting ways. So, for example, this lovely little Barbara Hepworth pencil drawing. When she was getting married, Barbara Hepworth asked her, "What do you want for a wedding present?" And she said, "Actually, I'd really like one of your drawings." And Barbara Hepworth gave her this. So very good to have friends. Terry Frost, another important influence, because Terry Frost was someone else who was interested in exploring the landscape, but also exploring color, even if here we've got mainly grays and blacks and whites, inspired by walking along the quayside in St Ives. So all of these artists were very inspired by their landscape. She was also inspired by Naum Garbro that we see here, his construction in space. So this way of using interesting materials and this use of texture and what becomes 2D, 3D, which is something, of course, Ben Nicholson is also working on in this period. And we see in her paintings what she tries to express, which she says is the joy and importance of color, texture, energy, and vibrancy with an awareness of space and construction. Or this one as well, these two ochre forms. Again, you can see the language keeps changing, but what remains is this sort of dynamic symmetry, this geometric symmetry. You can make parallels with some of the constructivists, again, the Russian constructivists. She also said that she wants her work to be a celebration of life, of taking risks and of creating the unexpected. So we see her doing that. And you've got to also remember some of the works that, Ben Nicholson was making in this period were the opposite of this color. He was kind of bleaching color from his works. And she starts to move away from landscape, and certainly by the 1960s is making these very purely abstract works, much more geometric, that have perhaps more in common with some of the early suprematist works of people like Malevich. We think of his Black Square. And so alongside her, we have Sandra Blow, again, English painter, abstract painter, one of the pioneers of that abstract movement in Britain of the 1950s, which starts, you could say, in the 1930s with the abstract sculptures of Barbara Hepworth, of course. I mean, we're focusing on the painters, but Hepworth too was investigating abstraction. And her works, also very large scale. She works with discarded materials. She was inspired by a bout of illness. She had scarlet fever when she was a child, and so started painting on her grandparents' fruit farm in Kent. And then she goes to St Martin's School of Art between 1941 and 1946, and then to the Royal Academy, and also on to the Accademia dei Belle Arti in Rome. And it's in Rome that she meets Alberto Burri. And Burri is going to become her partner for a few years, and they're going to travel around Italy together before they go to Paris. And even when they split up, Burri becomes this influence on her, because if, we, I think in Britain, tend to see Burri as the sack man, making these kind of works that first made him come to prominence with using sacking, that were inspired by his time in a prisoner of war camp in America as an Italian. And also using these materials that we tend to think of as a bit arte povera. But if you look at the whole of Burri's career, and I know some of you who, if you've lucky enough to come to Umbria and been to Città di Castello, to the Burri collection, you would just see how he kept innovating. And he was using plastics, and he was using Celotex, and using all kinds of different materials, and working with color and then taking color out, working with gold leaf, working with black, so constantly innovating, so as not to be seen as the sack man. So he was one influence. And the other, again, is Peter Lanyon, because Lanyon had come back to Cornwall, his native Cornwall, in 1946 after the Second World War. And he felt so much part of it, he felt so in tune really with Cornwall. He felt like it made up his identity, particularly the landscape of West Penwith. And he was painting in his attic studio in St Ives. So we see something, this influence of his work as well. So this interest in landscape materials. And she starts to explore that with works like this, oil paint on hardboard, which she began in Hertfordshire in 1959 and finished in London. She's very interested in creating some kind of tactile quality to her works. Sometimes she would use tea to dye the canvas so that she could get those natural colors. Sometimes she would create the impression that you were looking at a piece of wood or looking at tar by blackening, blackening the sort of canvas. Sometimes she wanted to make you think you were looking at sea spray, so there would be effects that seemed to imply that. So also she started to use liquid cement as well as things like charcoal. So all of this are ideas that she's been exploring alongside Alberto Burri and also Peter Lanyon, who is including organic materials in some of his works. And we see that her work started to get represented by Gimper Fils in 1951. So she was doing very well, having lots of exhibitions in New York, alongside people like Barbara Hepworth. She starts teaching at the Royal College and also teaching in Chelsea, becomes a Royal Academician, and always her work in different media. This is a screen print, for instance. Ditto this silk screen. We can see that even where it's a silk screen, she's introduced collaged elements so that the importance of texture and also the importance of transparency. So you could go back again to Naum Galbo there. And then she also creates a work like this, vivace, meaning lively, as we know. And in the 1980s, she starts throwing the paint on the canvas. And this is something, of course, that the abstract expressionists have been doing in the from the 1940s, 50s, 60s onwards. But she's doing it in a way to create something really joyous and semi-spontaneous. So there's always that slight, you can control the paint to a point, but there's always that element of chance which threatens to kind of intervene. And you can see by the splashes here, the way in which it's been made. And she's also included pieces of cardboard and paint. So again, mixing something, a language that's very improvisational and gestural and expressive with something very precise and ordered with the placing of the paper and the card on the canvas. And maintaining her studio in St Ives. So she went back to Cornwall in 1994 and then built herself this massive studio for her large work. So you can go and visit those, and still continued to exhibit every year until she died in 2006 in the summer exhibition. So that leads us kind of hopefully nicely into our last artist that I wanted to look at. And of course, there are so many more, but these as an example in different, let's say, in different contexts. And that would be the American artist Helen Frankenthaler. So we were talking about abstract expressionism. And she says something similar. What concerns me when I work is not whether the picture is a landscape or whether it's pastoral or whether somebody will see a sunset in it. What concerns me is, did I make a beautiful picture? She's someone who was also born into a quite well-off background. I think it's fair to say she was very much encouraged by her parents. She still suffered some trauma because her father died of cancer when she was only 11. So it was a very difficult period for her. But she was also able, through various holidays with her families, to go to the ocean, go to the sea, and this kind of causes her to fall in love a little bit with nature. She's going to train privately. She's going to go first to Bennington College, but then she's also going to train with Hans Hofmann. And Hans Hofmann, of course, was a very important influence for artists in this period. He'd been quite influential on the likes of Lee Krasner, for instance. And then her other influences were watercolors, particularly the works of Cézanne, and also the American watercolorist John Marin. And what she liked about them is that their work was light, but also that they were carrying on their watercolor practice into oil paint, so that their oil paints looked like watercolors. They seemed to liberate the paint from being something that was heavy and impasto, and this interested her very much. Also, what she liked, or what she took from Cézanne, is this notion of leaving certain areas of the canvas uncovered and white, something that you see, of course, the Impressionists had also done, and thinning down the oil. So this is something that had a big impact on her. And when she went to New York City in 1949, she organized an exhibition for various alumni artists in New York. And it's at this exhibition in 1950 that she meets the art critic Clement Greenberg, the art critic of the abstract expressionists. And she also meets Max Ernst, who had been married for a short while to Peggy Guggenheim. And she was interested in him partly because, of course, he was very intellectual, etc., but possibly as well because he was so well connected and she was incredibly ambitious. So this was quite a turbulent 5-year affair between the two of them. And mostly it opened up doors for her to meet the whole abstract expressionist scene, in particular Jackson Pollock, whose show that she saw at the Betty Parsons Gallery in New York. And she said, it was all there. I wanted to live in this land. I had to live there and master this language. So we know that she would go on holidays with Greenberg, for example, and Pollock and Lee Krasner. So she became part of that movement, not the first generation of abstract expressionists, but the second. And she said when she looked at his works, she thought about what makes a good picture. And she felt that a good picture looks as if it's happened all at once. It's an immediate image. For my own work, when a picture looks labored and overworked, and you can read in it, oh, she did this, then she did that, that is not got to do with beautiful art to me. So what she wanted to do is to get that sense of spontaneity in one, as she put it, elegant wrist movement. And she gets selected for his inclusion in a show called 15 Unknowns, and then she gets her first solo show in 1951, sorry. And this inspires her to really expand her vocabulary. So you can see that kind of looseness here. You can see the thinness of the paint. There's a real sort of continuity, even in the color palette between her works and the works of Pollock. However, it's really in 1952 when she makes Mountains and Sea that everything shifts for her, and she has her solo exhibition where this is exhibited. And this came after a trip to Nova Scotia. She starts using very, very thinned oil paint, and she's applying it with window wipers, with sponges. She's making very delicate charcoal outlines. All of this is being done with the canvas on the floor, like Pollock, and it really launches her career. And it also allows her at the exhibition to meet people, artists that she's going to have more in common with, that second generation, Morris Louis, Kenneth Noland, artists that are going to come to be known as the color field movement. So it's not a depiction of the Nova Scotia coastline, but you could see it as a kind of seascape because there's blues in it, which you could read as the sea. There's greens in it, which we could read as the ground, etc. And certainly at this point, she has found her own language, which separates her from what Pollock was doing and also what Krasner was doing. And we see here, she starts to experiment more and more with linear shapes, with organic forms, rounded forms. Then she starts to move in the 60s towards making things that are more symmetrical. She's using stains and blots rather than painting the shapes. Later, she starts to move in the 60s, like many artists, towards using acrylic. So that's going to give a different kind of definition to her works. But as we see, some of them, like this one, although it has a very specific title, A Basque Landscape, we do also see that it's totally abstract, and her use of color has been really incredible. And also her self-belief, and I think that's quite important, that even when no one knew her, she was making really big canvases. And that's quite unusual for an artist, even now, because you know that generally a small piece or a medium scale piece is much easier to sell. But nevertheless, she recognized in herself that her work was better big. It suited her aesthetic better. It suited her practice better. And very soon, there was no problem with selling the work. So she really had a kind of important self-belief. And also looking at how she could draw with color, and that's what she called it, drawing with color, by pouring this paint onto an unprimed canvas on the floor. And then even when she switches to acrylic paint, as we see here in this one, this kind of group of colors, which is meant to again be very joyous. It's called April Mood, so it's supposed to capture something of that excited nature of spring and so on. It still has elements where you can see the colors kind of bleeding into one another, familiar perhaps from, you know, artists like Rothko with their color field paintings and so on. She said there are no rules, and that's how breakthroughs happen. And in all of her work, you know, you can't pin her down to a specific style, because if we go back to one of her earlier works, for example, this one from 1951, you can see she's using still oil and charcoal on canvas here. And it's very similar, perhaps, to where we started with Kandinsky, and very different to her later soap stain paintings. But what they share is this absolute joyous use of color. And I think for that, she has to be celebrated as one of the very great abstract painters. So I'm going to finish there. As I say, there are so many other artists we could look at. You could think also about, of course, the great Lee Krasner and her own contributions, if we're looking at some of the abstract, American abstract expressionist painters, lots of others. But I'm going to stop there because I think it would be great to open up to some questions or some comments.
So thank you, Marianne. That was absolutely fantastic. And oh gosh, we've covered so much ground, haven't we? I mean, it's incredible, and you really have shown that this myth busting really of the idea that abstraction was really A, only done by men, and B, that it was pioneered by men. I mean, there are so many things I could pull out. I'm sure everyone's going to be typing away, and while they're doing that, I'll just kick us off with perhaps a couple of observations from your lovely talk. So, you know, from Hilma af Klint, you know, doing those abstract works from 1907, how incredible. And again, we have the point you just made there about the scale. And there are a few things that sort of struck me as I was listening that all the women had in common, which was ambition, often working on a large scale. Nearly all of them that you cited worked on a large scale, perhaps not Vanessa Bell, but the others. The circumstances of their kind of upbringing and access to training and things that inspired them early on, that seemed to be very important too. And then connections, and we heard obviously you know, brilliant for Helen Frankenthaler to have the, you know, chutzpah to make the most of those connections. And, you know, that really made a difference. And then earlier, people like Sonia Delaunay, obviously moving in very influential circles, but a circle that she really, you know,
they earned their place.
Yes.
Yeah, in those circles. They weren't there just to kind of as the wife of, they really earned their place as innovators in their own right, I think. A bit, I mean, another one we could have talked about was Natalia Goncharova, the Russian artist, is another, you know, great example also of a good pairing with Larionov. But yes, they earned their place, I think. I don't know.
And just some of the other things I really enjoyed. So I loved the Sonia Delaunay pictures, and this idea that we should paint our car to match our clothes, or was it the other way? Who knows? I think they'll all be working on that one. And, you know, just her sheer inventiveness early on. Obviously, she was living in this really inspiring age, which was just all these artists were having these incredible ideas everywhere, but she was not just part of it, she was really leading it so much, and looking at modernism through modern inventions like electric light and so on. I see there's a question or comment in the chat.
Really Van Gogh's maintained that her glacier paintings inspired Ben Nicholson rather than the other way around. I'm sure, you know, I think there's this is the continual problem, I have to say, with women artists, that nearly always they get to you know, their influence on the male artist never seems to be discussed. And I'm sure that was the case. I mean, he was definitely inspired by Hepworth, that goes without saying. So yes, I think it's very likely. And also how undervalued, you know, when you look up the prices of some of these artists, it's really shocking how little some of their works have gone for over the years compared to their male counterparts. That's something else that struck me.
Something that seems to, there's some redress now, but it's always that certain women are kind of allowed to have made it through. Yes. and become very celebrated. But you also touched on that unsung theme, which we're taking up later in this series, looking at those women who just sort of fell off the map, and certainly Anna Meers, who you mentioned, had these important London shows, and she was taken up for a while by Erica Browson, the brilliant Erica Browson herself, an emigre of the Hanover Gallery, and who, you know, pioneered showing Francis Bacon and so on. She did also show women like Anna Meers, but I think also there perhaps you touched on her kind of peripatetic lifestyle, and this is something else we find often with the ones who travel and spend a long time out of Britain, then find it difficult to build up that reputation.
Absolutely. And also what happens to women's work. I mean, I think, you know, she's not obviously not an abstract artist, but even recently the kind of recovery of Pauline Boty and the difficulties of and all this work that was just in a lockup, and it seems to happen a lot, that artists, you know, as they move around, they lose work, or they can't store it, and yeah, things disappear.
And that was important that you touched on legacy, the planning of her legacy by Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, and another one that did that, of course, was Marie-Louise von Motositsky, not an abstractionist.
Yes, this is a really good point, and it's I think we're seeing it now, which is very interesting. If you look at an artist like Tracy Emin, who you could argue has already made it into the history books, but boy, is she planning her legacy. Nothing wrong with that, but it is very interesting that you'd think she wouldn't almost need to, but she obviously does feel the need to make sure that she is in control of it.
And Una Richmond, who's our lovely academic advisor on the exhibition, is asking here, in her early career, was Sonia Delaunay better known for her textiles rather than her paintings?
That's a good question. I think probably yes, to be honest, because also, you know, when you look at the paintings that Robert Delaunay was making, they were making very similar works. They are quite indistinguishable, both with similar motifs, the Eiffel Tower, the electric prisms. So I imagine what set her apart more was her textiles, that they would have been the thing that would have, you know, especially if people were wearing her clothes, literally coming to her salons wearing her clothes, going out dancing wearing her clothes.
Sounds such fun.
No, we need a little, go back in time. That would be a nice thing to drop in on. I
think you mentioned also importantly that possibly she was the inspiration, because she had in making the textile for her young son, that was an idea they then explored together. So that was rather nice.
Yes, yes.
And there's some other thanks here from Francesca and others.
Going way back. Yes, that was a wonderful exhibition. That 70 artists, ironic that because they all get overlooked. That's a very good point. They had a wonderful Frankenthaler in that exhibition, didn't they? At the Whitechapel, actually, more than one. But yes, very true. This is the problem, isn't it? There were so many of them. And all, as you said, so many of them have been overlooked. And it's maybe going to change a little bit because we are getting more sort of art histories being written, some of them exclusively of women artists. But even then, I think there is a temptation, especially if you're producing a big survey work, to keep pulling out the same women because there's already things written on. It's easier to research. You can find the images. You kind of get into this pattern where you're just creating a new canon with the same women. And I think our job, if anything, is sort of, if you're interested in recuperating these, is to look also for the ones that are not there. The ones that were there and no longer there. That to me is the next project, if you like.
That happened. Well, that seems
Sarah is one of our champions. I champion you because you're doing this.
Well, thank you so much. That's been such a rich talk. I'm sure everyone's just, still reeling with so much information and wonderful slides. That seems a really appropriate place for us to end, although I'm sure we could go on for a long time. But I really would like to thank you for that sort of fascinating talk. And yes, there's more thanks coming in there. So I also just wanted to quickly thank my colleague Greta for her behind the scenes assistance, and more thanks there from Cecile. And to say, please join us next week if you can at the same time for a panel discussion that will be on Bloomsbury women with Frances Spalding, Grace Brockington and John King. And don't forget to come and see some of the pioneering abstractionists from tonight's talk in the exhibition at Benery Gallery. So thank you again, Marianne, and thank you for everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Just let those thanks all come in, and then we'll say good evening.